Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our amazing true stories that will touch your heart and change how you see the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Bennet stood at attention in his crisp red uniform. His black bearskin hat sat perfectly on his head, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. Thomas had served as a royal guard for 12 years, and in all that time, he had never once broken protocol. He was known among his fellow guards as someone who took his duty seriously, perhaps too seriously according to some. Thomas came from a working-class family in Manchester. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a nurse. When he joined the Royal Guard at 22, his parents had been so proud they cried at the ceremony. For Thomas, this job was not just about standing still and looking impressive. It meant something deeper. It represented honor, tradition, and a connection to something greater than himself. On this particular morning, King Charles was scheduled to inspect the guards before an important state visit. Thomas had prepared for weeks. His uniform had been cleaned and pressed 3 times. He had practiced his salute until his arm ached. Everything had to be perfect because Thomas believed that perfection was what the monarchy deserved. As the king approached with his entourage, Thomas felt his heart beat faster. He had been this close to royalty many times before, but today felt different. There was tension in the air that he could not quite explain. The king moved down the line of guards, occasionally nodding or making brief comments to his advisors. When he reached Thomas, something unexpected happened. The king stopped and stared at Thomas for a long moment. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, he said something that would change everything. He pointed at a tiny wrinkle in Thomas's uniform collar, barely visible to the naked eye, and said sharply that this level of sloppiness was unacceptable. He continued speaking, his voice growing louder, criticizing not just the uniform, but suggesting that Thomas represented a declining standard in the royal service. Thomas felt his face burn with shame. Around him, he could sense the other guards trying not to react, but he knew they were listening to every word. Tourists and photographers captured the moment on their phones and cameras. Within minutes, the incident would be all over social media. The king's words cut deep, not because they were particularly harsh, but because Thomas had dedicated his entire adult life to this service. After the king moved on, Thomas remained at attention, but inside he was crumbling. His hands trembled slightly inside his white gloves. He wanted to explain that the wrinkle had appeared because he had helped an elderly tourist who had fallen just before the inspection. He had caught the woman before she hit the ground, and in doing so, his collar had twisted. But guards do not speak unless spoken to. Guards do not make excuses. Guards simply stand and endure. When his shift ended hours later, Thomas walked to the changing room in silence. His fellow guards patted his shoulder in sympathy, but no one knew what to say. How do you comfort someone who has been humiliated by the king himself in front of the world? Thomas changed out of his uniform slowly, his mind replaying the moment again and again. That evening, Thomas sat in his small apartment watching the news. Sure enough, the incident was everywhere. Some people defended the king, saying standards must be maintained. Others criticized him for being too harsh over something so minor. Thomas turned off the television and sat in the dark, wondering if his career was over. Would he be reassigned? Would he be asked to leave the service? Worse, would he forever be known as the guard who wasn't good enough? But Thomas did not know something important. He did not know that the king's behavior that morning had nothing to do with him or his uniform. He did not know about the letter the king had received just an hour before the inspection, a letter that had shaken him to his core. He did not know about the secret that the king had been carrying for months, a secret so heavy that it sometimes made him lash out at those around him without meaning to. Thomas also did not know that someone had been watching the entire incident very carefully. This person had seen not just what happened in the courtyard, but had noticed something else. Something that would eventually reveal the truth behind the king's behavior. This observer had connections, resources, and most importantly, a conscience that would not let this injustice stand. As Thomas lay in bed that night, Unable to sleep, his phone buzzed with messages from friends and family who had seen the news. They offered support and love, but their words felt hollow. How could anyone understand what it felt like to have your life's work dismissed in seconds? How could anyone know the shame of being made an example of in front of the world? What Thomas did not realize was that this humiliating moment would actually be the beginning of something extraordinary. The truth that was about to unfold would not only restore his honor, but would also reveal a side of the monarchy that no one had ever seen before. Sometimes the darkest moments in our lives are just the opening chapter of a much bigger story, one we cannot yet imagine. 3 days after the incident, Thomas received an official summons to meet with the chief of palace security. His stomach dropped when he saw the envelope. This was it, he thought. They were going to dismiss him. He would lose everything he had worked for, all because of one moment that had gone viral across the internet. Thomas put on his civilian clothes and made his way to the administrative offices of the palace. As he walked through the corridors he had patrolled for years, everything felt different now. The paintings on the walls seemed to judge him. The other staff members he passed avoided making eye contact. He felt like a ghost haunting his own former life. The chief of security, Colonel Margaret Davies, was a stern woman in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had served in the military for 30 years before taking this position. Thomas had always respected her, though he had rarely interacted with her directly. When he entered her office, she gestured for him to sit without smiling. For a long moment, she simply looked at him. Then she asked him a strange question. She asked if he had noticed anything unusual about the king that morning. Thomas was confused. What did she mean? She pressed further, asking if the king had seemed himself, if his behavior had struck Thomas as normal. Thomas admitted that the king had seemed tense, perhaps even angry before he had reached Thomas in the line. Colonel Davies nodded slowly, as if Thomas had confirmed something she had suspected. Then she told him something that was not supposed to leave that room. She explained that the king had been under enormous strain recently. She did not give details, but she said that there were private matters affecting him deeply. She made it clear that this did not excuse his treatment of Thomas, but it provided context that the public would never know. Thomas did not know what to say. Was she trying to make him feel better? Was this an official apology? Colonel Davies seemed to sense his confusion. She told him directly that he was not being dismissed or reassigned. In fact, she said, his service record was exemplary, and that incident would not define his career. But then she said something else, something that surprised him even more. She told Thomas that she needed his help. There was a situation developing that required discretion and careful handling. She could not give him all the details yet, but she needed to know if he was willing to be patient and trust her. Thomas agreed without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. What choice did he have? Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, someone else was investigating what had really happened that morning. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was a journalist who specialized in royal affairs. Unlike many reporters who chased scandals for clicks and views, Sarah believed in thorough research and fair reporting. She had watched the video of the king berating Thomas dozens of times, and something about it bothered her. Sarah had covered the royal family for 15 years. She knew their patterns, their habits, their usual behaviors. The king's outbursts seemed out of character. Yes, he could be particular about details, but this level of public criticism was unusual. She began digging deeper, talking to her sources within the palace, piecing together fragments of information. What Sarah discovered was troubling. In the weeks leading up to the incident, the king had received several threatening letters. These were not the usual cranks that celebrities and politicians deal with regularly. These letters contained specific information about the king's family, details that should have been private. Someone with inside knowledge was trying to intimidate him. The letters demanded that the king make certain decisions regarding palace staff and appointments. They threatened to reveal damaging information about a member of the royal family if he did not comply. The king had reported the letters to security, but he had been told to continue his normal schedule while they investigated. The stress of carrying this secret while maintaining a public facade had been enormous. On the morning he had inspected the guards, the king had received another letter. This one had been more explicit in its threats. It had mentioned his grandchildren by name. For a grandfather, for any parent, such a threat would be devastating. The king had gone to the inspection trying to maintain composure. But his fear and anger had found an outlet in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thomas had simply been standing there when the king's carefully controlled. Emotions had broken through. Sarah knew she had an important story, but she faced a difficult choice. If she published what she knew, it might help people understand why the king had acted as he did. It might restore some sympathy for him and perhaps reduce the criticism he had faced. But it would also expose a security threat and potentially put the royal family in more danger. It could make whoever was sending the threats even bolder as Sarah wrestled with this decision. Something else happened that would change everything. One of her sources contacted her with urgent information. They told her that Thomas, the guard who had been humiliated, was actually connected to the person sending the threats. Not intentionally, not consciously, but connected nonetheless. The source said that if Sarah wanted the full story, she needed to look into Thomas's family background more carefully. This information stunned Sarah. Could Thomas somehow be involved? It seemed impossible. Every report she had read indicated he was a model guard with an impeccable record. But journalists learned to follow every lead, no matter how unlikely it seems. She began researching Thomas Bennett's family, his friends, his connections. What she found would reveal a conspiracy that reached much deeper than anyone had imagined. A conspiracy that tied together past and present in ways that would shock everyone involved. Sarah Mitchell spent the next week buried in research. She searched through public records, old newspaper archives, and social media profiles. What she discovered about Thomas Bennett's family was not what she had expected. Thomas himself was exactly who he appeared to be, an honest and dedicated guard. But his uncle, a man named Richard Bennett, was a different story altogether. Richard Bennett had worked at the palace 25 years. Earlier, as part of the maintenance staff, he had been fired after being caught stealing valuable items from storage rooms. The dismissal had been quiet to avoid scandal, but it had destroyed Richard's life. He had been unable to find decent work afterward. The shame had eaten away at him for decades, turning him bitter and angry. He blamed the royal family for ruining his life, even though he had brought it upon himself. Sarah discovered that Richard had recently been released from prison after serving time for fraud. During his time in jail, he had connected with other criminals, people who had skills in hacking and information gathering. When he got out, Richard had become obsessed with revenge against the royal family. He wanted them to feel the humiliation he had felt. He wanted to hurt them the way he believed they had hurt him. The threatening letters to the king had come from Richard. He had used his criminal connections to gather private information about the royal family. But Richard had been clever. He had never mentioned Thomas or their family connection in any way. He had kept his nephew completely separate from his scheme. Thomas had no idea what his uncle was doing. The two had not even spoken in over 5 years. However, Richard had been watching Thomas's career with interest. When he saw the viral video of the king humiliating Thomas, something shifted in his mind. He saw an opportunity. Richard knew that if people discovered Thomas was his nephew, they might suspect Thomas of being involved in the threats. The scandal would destroy Thomas's career and reputation. Richard thought this would hurt the royal family even more, showing that they had humiliated an innocent man while his relative was actually the one threatening them. Sarah realized she was sitting on an explosive story, but she also realized that publishing it now could destroy an innocent man's life. Thomas had done nothing wrong, yet if the connection between him and Richard became public, people would assume the worst. The internet would tear him apart. His career would be over. His family would suffer. All because of crimes committed by an uncle he barely knew. She decided she needed to talk to Thomas directly before making any decisions about publication. She reached out through careful channels, asking for a private meeting. Thomas was suspicious at first. He had dealt with enough reporters after the incident to know they usually wanted sensational quotes, not the truth. But something about Sarah's message convinced him to meet her at a quiet cafe away from the palace. When they sat down together, Sarah was direct. She told Thomas what she had discovered about his Uncle Richard. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, looking for any sign that he knew about the threats. What she saw instead was pure shock. Thomas had gone pale. His hands gripped his coffee cup so tightly she thought it might shatter. Thomas told Sarah that he had known his uncle was troubled, but he had no idea Richard had been released from prison or that he was doing anything illegal. The last time Thomas had seen Richard was at his father's funeral 5 years ago. Even then, Richard had been drunk and angry, ranting about injustices and revenge. Thomas had avoided him after that, not wanting that kind of negativity in his life. Sarah believed him. She had interviewed enough people to know when someone was lying, and Thomas was clearly telling the truth. But she also knew that belief was not the same as proof. She told Thomas that she was going to investigate further before publishing anything. She promised to be fair, but she also warned him that eventually this story would come out. It was too big to stay hidden forever. After their meeting, Thomas sat in his apartment, feeling the walls closing in. It was bad enough that the king had humiliated him in front of the world. Now he learned that his uncle was a criminal, threatening the royal family. Even though he was innocent, how could he prove it? How could he show that he had nothing to do with Richard's schemes? The connection alone would be enough to destroy his reputation. That night, Thomas made a difficult decision. He contacted Colonel Davies and told her everything Sarah had revealed to him. He explained about his uncle, the old dismissal, the recent release from prison. He offered to resign immediately if that would help protect the palace. Colonel Davies listened quietly, then told him to do absolutely nothing. She said that resigning would only make him look guilty. She told him to continue his duties. Normally, while she handled the situation, what neither Thomas nor Sarah knew was that palace security had actually identified Richard Bennett as the source of the threats 2 days earlier. They had been watching him, gathering evidence to build a case strong enough to ensure a long prison sentence. They had also discovered the family connection to Thomas and had been quietly investigating whether Thomas was involved. Their investigation had cleared him completely. Colonel Davies had been waiting for the right moment to act. She wanted to catch Richard in the act of sending another threat or making contact with his criminal associates. But now, with a journalist digging into the story, timing became critical. If the story broke before they arrested Richard, he might flee or destroy evidence. The situation required careful coordination. The next morning, palace security, working with police, moved in to arrest Richard Bennett. They caught him at his apartment with evidence of his crimes spread across his computer. He had been drafting another threatening letter when they knocked on his door. At first, Richard seemed almost relieved to be caught. The constant paranoia of carrying out his revenge plot had exhausted him. But when he learned that his actions might have hurt Thomas, something in him broke. Richard began to cry. He told the investigators that Thomas was a good person, maybe the only good person in their entire family. He swore that he had never intended to involve Thomas or damage his reputation. He had kept their connection secret, specifically to protect his nephew. The irony was bitter. Richard's attempt at revenge had ended up threatening the one person he actually cared about. The arrest of Richard Bennett happened quickly and quietly. But news has a way of leaking out no matter how careful authorities try to be. Within 48 hours, rumors began circulating that someone had been arrested for threatening the royal family. Sarah Mitchell heard the rumors through her sources and knew her exclusive story window was closing. She had to make a decision about how to report what she knew. Sarah thought about her responsibility as a journalist. She could write a sensational piece connecting all the dots: the threats, the arrest, the family connection to Thomas, and the king's outburst. It would get millions of views. It would be the biggest story of her career. But it would also destroy Thomas Bennett, an innocent man who had already suffered enough. Instead, Sarah made a choice that surprised her editors. She wrote a carefully crafted article that explained the basic facts without revealing Thomas's identity or his connection to Richard. She reported that a former palace employee with a grudge had been arrested for making threats. She explained that the king had been under severe stress at the time of his inspection of the guards. She even included expert commentary about how stress can cause people to act out of character. Her article was fair and balanced, but it deliberately left out the detail that would have made it explosive. Her editors were frustrated. They wanted the full story. Sarah stood her ground. She told them that publishing Thomas's name would ruin an innocent man's life without adding any real value to the story. After heated discussions, they reluctantly agreed to run the article as she had written it. When Thomas read Sarah's article, he felt overwhelming relief mixed with gratitude. She had protected him when she did not have to. She had chosen his well-being over her career advancement. He wanted to thank her but did not know how. What do you say to someone who has saved your reputation, possibly your entire future? At the palace, reaction to the article was mixed. Some officials were relieved that the full story had not come out. Others worried that eventually someone else would make the connection between Thomas and Richard. Colonel Davies called Thomas into her office again. This time, her expression was less stern, almost sympathetic. She told Thomas that the palace wanted to issue a statement. They wanted to make it clear that the guard who had been criticized by the king was completely uninvolved in the threats and had been fully cleared by their investigation. They wanted to acknowledge that the king's behavior that day had been influenced by stress from the threats he was receiving. It would not be an apology exactly, but it would be something close to it. Thomas did not know what to say. Part of him wanted that acknowledgement desperately. He wanted people to know he had done nothing wrong, that he was still the dedicated guard he had always been. But another part of him worried that such a statement would only draw more attention to him. It might prompt other journalists to dig deeper, to find what Sarah had chosen not to publish. Before Thomas could respond, Colonel Davies told him something else. She said that the king himself had requested to speak with Thomas privately. No cameras, no witnesses, no official record. Just the two of them. Thomas felt his heart race. He did not know if he wanted to face the man who had humiliated him, even if that man was the king. The meeting was arranged for the following evening in one of the palace's private sitting rooms. Thomas arrived in his civilian clothes, feeling more nervous than he had ever felt on duty. A staff member led him through quiet corridors to a modest room with comfortable chairs and warm lighting. Then the king entered alone. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other across the space that separated them. The king looked older than he did in photographs, more tired. The weight of his position and his recent ordeal showed in his face. Thomas stood at attention from habit. Even though he was not in uniform, the king gestured for Thomas to sit, then sat down himself. He began speaking quietly, almost hesitatingly. He told Thomas that he had acted poorly that morning. He explained about the threats, the fear for his family, the terrible pressure of knowing someone was watching, waiting to hurt the people he loved. He said that none of this excused his treatment of Thomas, but he wanted Thomas to understand what had been happening. Then the king said something that surprised Thomas even more. He said he had reviewed Thomas's service record. He had learned about Thomas's 12 years of dedicated service, his perfect attendance, his numerous commendations. He had also learned about the elderly tourist Thomas had helped just before the inspection, the reason for the wrinkled collar. The king said he should have asked about the wrinkle instead of assuming the worst. He should have been better. Thomas felt something shift inside him. This was the king, one of the most powerful people in the country, admitting he had made a mistake. Apologizing without actually using those exact words, because kings do not apologize in the way regular people do. But the meaning was clear. Thomas found his voice and thanked the king for telling him the truth. The two men talked for nearly an hour. The king asked about Thomas's family, his life, his hopes for the future. Thomas found himself relaxing, speaking honestly about what the job meant to him. The king listened with genuine interest. By the end of their conversation, something unexpected had happened. They had found a strange kind of mutual respect. Maybe even the beginning of understanding. As Thomas left the palace that night, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The humiliation was still there in his memory. Still painful, but it felt different now. He understood that the king was human, flawed and struggling like everyone else. He understood that sometimes people hurt others not out of malice, but out of their own pain and fear. What Thomas did not know was that their conversation had been important for the king as well. The king had been carrying guilt about the incident, knowing he had treated an innocent man unfairly. Having the chance to explain and to connect with Thomas as one human to another had lifted some of that burden. Sometimes the process of making things right helps both the victim and the person who caused the harm. But the story was not over yet. Richard Bennett, sitting in his jail cell awaiting trial, had been following the news coverage closely. He had read Sarah's article. He had heard rumors about a possible palace statement, and he had made a decision that would add one more unexpected twist to this already complicated tale. Richard Bennett sat in his small cell, staring at the concrete walls that would be his home for years to come. His lawyer had told him the evidence against him was overwhelming. The threatening letters, the digital trail, the testimony of his criminal associates, who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Richard was looking at a long prison term, possibly 10 years or more. But what haunted Richard, more than his impending sentence, was the knowledge of what he had almost done to Thomas. His nephew had built a good life through hard work and dedication. Thomas had escaped the cycle of bitterness and failure that had trapped so many in their family. And Richard had nearly destroyed it all because of his own twisted need for revenge. Richard asked his lawyer to arrange something unusual. He wanted to write a letter to the palace, to the king specifically. His lawyer advised against it, saying anything he wrote could be used against him in court. But Richard insisted. He said he needed to say something, and his sentence was already going to be harsh regardless of what he wrote. The lawyer reluctantly agreed to deliver the letter. In his letter, Richard did something he had not done in decades. He took full responsibility for his actions. He wrote about his theft from the palace 25 years earlier, about how being fired had felt like the end of his world. He explained how that shame had festered into anger, how anger had become obsession. He apologized for the fear and stress he had caused the king and his family. But the heart of Richard's letter was about Thomas. He wrote that Thomas was the best person in their family, maybe the best person Richard had ever known. He explained that Thomas had no knowledge of the threats, no involvement whatsoever. He begged the king not to let Thomas's career suffer because of his uncle's crimes. Richard said that if any good could come from his terrible mistakes, let it be that Thomas was protected and his reputation restored. When the king received the letter, he read it several times. He showed it to Colonel Davies and to his closest advisors. They discussed what to do with this information. Some argued that nothing should be done, that Richard's letter changed nothing. Others saw an opportunity to fully close this chapter in a way that would help everyone involved. The king made a decision. He would issue a public statement after all, but not the careful diplomatic statement that had been originally planned. Instead, he would speak personally and directly about what had happened. His communications team was nervous about this approach. Royal statements were usually measured and formal, but the king insisted that this situation required something more human. The statement was released on a Monday morning. In it, the king acknowledged that he had been under severe stress from credible threats against his family at the time of the inspection. He stated clearly that the guard he had criticized, Thomas Bennett, had served with distinction for 12 years and had done nothing wrong. The king admitted his behavior had been unfair and that Thomas deserved better treatment. Then the king went further. He announced that Thomas would receive a commendation for his years of exemplary service. He also stated that the person responsible for the threats was in custody and that Thomas had no connection to or knowledge of those crimes. The statement was remarkably direct and honest for a royal communication. The public reaction was immediate and largely positive. People appreciated the king's candor and his willingness to acknowledge his mistake. Social media, which had been brutal to both the king and Thomas during the initial incident, now filled with supportive messages. Many people shared their own stories of acting badly under stress and later regretting it. The situation became a teaching moment about grace, forgiveness, and the complexity of human behavior. For Thomas, the statement changed everything. His fellow guards treated him with new respect. Strangers stopped him on the street to shake his hand. His parents called him crying with joy and relief. The shame and humiliation he had carried for weeks finally began to lift. He was not the guard who had been humiliated anymore. He was the guard who had been wronged and then vindicated. Sarah Mitchell wrote a follow-up article, this time with Thomas's cooperation. She told the fuller story now that it was safe to do so. She explained about Richard's past with the palace, his arrest, his letter taking responsibility. She highlighted Thomas's complete innocence and the king's unusual public acknowledgement. Her article was widely shared and praised for its thorough and compassionate reporting. Thomas met with Sarah again to thank her properly. He told her that her initial restraint in not revealing his identity had given him the space to survive those early days. If she had published everything she knew right away, the situation would have spiraled out of control before the truth could emerge. Sarah admitted that it had been the hardest professional decision of her career, but she was glad she had made it. One afternoon, Thomas received an unexpected phone call. It was from Richard's lawyer asking if Thomas would be willing to visit Richard in jail. Thomas's first instinct was to refuse. Why would he want to see the uncle whose actions had nearly destroyed his life? But something made him reconsider. Maybe it was the king's example of acknowledging mistakes and seeking understanding. Maybe it was his own need for closure. Thomas agreed to the visit. When he sat across from Richard in the prison visiting room, he barely recognized the man he remembered. Richard looked broken, smaller somehow, as if his crimes and their consequences had physically diminished him. They sat in awkward silence for a moment before Richard spoke. Richard apologized to Thomas with tears in his eyes. He said he was sorry for everything, for the threats, for the risk he had put Thomas in, for being such a failure of an uncle. He said he understood if Thomas hated him and never wanted to see him again. He just needed Thomas to know that he was sorry. Thomas looked at the man across from him and felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but something close to it. He saw that Richard was a person who had made terrible choices, who had let bitterness poison his life, but who was still capable of regret and remorse. Thomas told Richard that he was angry about what had happened, but he also understood that Richard had tried to protect him in his own twisted way. Thomas said he would not be visiting again. He needed to move forward with his life, and that meant leaving this chapter behind. But he wanted Richard to know that he did not hate him. He hoped Richard would use his time in prison to find some peace and maybe even some redemption. They parted without embracing, without any dramatic reconciliation. Sometimes closure is quiet and incomplete, and that has to be enough. 6 months passed, and life gradually returned to something resembling normal. Thomas continued his duties as a royal guard, but the experience had changed him in subtle ways. He was less rigid now, more willing to see the humanity in situations rather than just the protocol. His fellow guards noticed the change, and many said he seemed more at peace with himself. The commendation ceremony was held on a crisp autumn morning. Thomas stood in his perfect uniform, but this time there was no anxiety, no fear of being judged. The king himself presented the medal, and as he pinned it to Thomas's chest, their eyes met. No words were needed. Both men understood what this moment represented, not just official recognition, but a closing of a painful chapter for both of them. After the ceremony, Thomas was surprised to learn he had been selected for a new position. He would be training new recruits, passing on his knowledge and experience to the next generation of guards. It was an honor usually reserved for guards near retirement, but Colonel Davies had personally recommended him. She said that someone who had been through what Thomas had experienced would be able to teach recruits not just about duty and protocol, but about resilience and character. Thomas accepted the position with gratitude. He discovered he loved teaching. The young recruits looked up to him not because he was perfect, but because he had faced adversity and come through it with his integrity and tact. He told them his story, not dwelling on the humiliation, but focusing on what he had learned about grace under pressure and the importance of seeing people as human beings rather than just their titles or positions. Sarah Mitchell's career flourished after her coverage of the story. Other journalists recognized that her careful, ethical approach had actually resulted in better journalism than if she had rushed to publish everything she knew. She received awards for her reporting and was offered positions at larger publications, but she chose to stay where she was, continuing to cover the royal family with the same balance of curiosity and compassion that defined her work on this story. Sarah and Thomas became unlikely friends. They would meet occasionally for coffee, talking about their lives and the strange journey that had brought them together. Sarah told Thomas that he had restored her faith in people's capacity for forgiveness and growth. Thomas told Sarah that she had shown him that integrity still mattered, even in a world that often rewarded sensationalism over truth. The king himself seemed different after the incident. Those who worked closely with him noticed that he was more patient, more willing to listen before reacting. He had learned that his actions, even small ones, carried enormous weight. A moment of frustration or anger could devastate someone's life. He tried to be more mindful, more careful with the power he wielded simply by being who he was. The king also made changes to how the palace handled security threats. He insisted on better support systems for himself and his family when dealing with such situations. He did not want stress and fear to make him lash out at innocent people again. The incident with Thomas had been a wake-up call about the importance of managing the psychological toll of his position. Richard Bennett served his sentence quietly. He was a model prisoner, participating in educational programs and counseling. He wrote letters to Thomas occasionally, always brief and respectful, never demanding responses. Thomas read the letters but rarely replied. The distance between them remained, but it was no longer filled with anger or bitterness, just a sad acknowledgement of what might have been if Richard had made different choices. One day, almost a year after the incident, Thomas was training a new group of recruits when a young woman approached him nervously. She asked if he was the Thomas Bennett from the news story. Thomas confirmed that he was bracing himself for whatever would come next. The woman smiled and told him that his story had inspired her. To apply to the Royal Guard program, she explained that she had been struggling with feelings of inadequacy and fear of failure. Seeing how Thomas had handled being publicly humiliated and then vindicated had given her courage. She said if he could face that level of scrutiny and come through it with grace, then she could face her own fears. Thomas was deeply moved. He had never thought of his painful experience as something that could inspire others. Thomas realized then that our worst moments can become our most meaningful ones. Not because of the pain itself, but because of how we respond to it. He had not chosen to be humiliated in front of the world. He had not asked for his uncle to threaten the royal family, but he had chosen how to handle those situations with dignity, honesty, and a willingness to see the humanity in others. Even those who had hurt him, the story that had begun with a moment of public shame had become something else entirely. It became a story about the complexity of human nature, about how stress can make even powerful people act poorly, and about how truth and compassion can heal wounds that seem impossible to mend. Thomas often thought about the chain of events that had unfolded. If Richard had not sent those threats, the king would not have been under such stress. If the king had not lashed out, the incident would never have gone viral. If Sarah had not chosen ethical journalism over sensationalism, Thomas's connection to Richard might have destroyed him. If the king had not been willing to acknowledge his mistake, healing would never have been possible. Every link in that chain mattered. One evening, Thomas sat in his apartment looking at the commendation medal on his shelf. Next to it was a framed photograph from his first day as a Royal Guard 12 years earlier. He looked so young in that photo, so certain that the world was divided into simple categories of right and wrong, duty and failure. The man he saw in the mirror now was different, marked by experience, but also enriched by it. Thomas thought about what he would tell his younger self. If he could send a message back through time, he would say that perfection is not the goal. Being human, flawed, and struggling is not a weakness, but the truth of existence. He would say that the moments that break us can also remake us into something better, if we let them. He would say that grace and forgiveness are not signs of weakness, but of strength. The palace continued its routines. The guards standing at attention, the tourists taking photographs, the machinery of tradition and ceremony moving forward as it had for centuries. But within those walls, people remembered what had happened. They remembered that even kings make mistakes, that even the most dedicated servants can face injustice, and that sometimes the path to resolution requires courage from everyone involved. Thomas's parents visited him in London that winter. They stood outside the palace and watched him on duty, pride shining in their eyes. After his shift, they went to dinner together. His mother held his hand across the table and told him how proud she was, not just of his career, but of the man he had become. His father, a man of few words, simply nodded and said that Thomas had handled everything with honor. As Thomas walked them back to their hotel that night, his mother asked him if he had forgiven the king. Thomas thought about the question carefully before answering. He said that forgiveness was complicated. The king had hurt him, but the king had also been hurting. The king had made a mistake, but the king had also made it right. Thomas said he had let go of his anger. Maybe that was what forgiveness really meant. Years would pass, and Thomas would continue his service, eventually retiring with honors after 25 years. He would train hundreds of guards, each one learning not just the procedures and protocols, but the deeper lessons about character and resilience that only experience can teach. Some of his trainees would go on to positions of great responsibility, and they would carry with them the wisdom Thomas had shared. Sarah would write a book about the incident and its aftermath, thoughtful exploration of power, accountability, and redemption in modern Britain. The book would become a bestseller, prompting discussions about how society treats public figures and how the media shapes narratives. Sarah would donate a portion of the proceeds to organizations supporting people who had been unfairly treated by employers. Honoring Thomas's experience by helping others, the king would continue his reign, marked by both his successes and his failures. But those close to him would always remember the incident with Thomas as a turning point, a moment when he learned to balance the weight of his crown with the vulnerability of his humanity. He would speak occasionally about the importance of acknowledging mistakes, though he never mentioned Thomas by name in these speeches. Some lessons are too personal to share publicly, even for kings. And Richard would eventually be released from prison years later, a changed man. He would live quietly, working simple jobs and staying away from anything that might lead him back down the dark path he had walked. He would never reconnect with Thomas, respecting his nephew's need for distance. But he would keep a newspaper clipping about Thomas's commendation ceremony in his wallet, a reminder of the good that had survived despite his worst efforts to destroy it. The world moved on, as it always does. New scandals replaced old ones in the news cycle. People forgot about the viral video of a king berating a guard, but for those directly involved, the memory remained vivid. A reminder that our worst moments can teach us our most important lessons. Thomas eventually met someone, a teacher named Emma, who shared his values of integrity and kindness. They married in a small ceremony attended by family and close friends, including Sarah and several of Thomas's fellow guards. Colonel Davies came to the wedding and gave a short speech about how proud she was of the man Thomas had become. Even the king sent a personal note of congratulation, a gesture that meant more to Thomas than any public recognition could. As Thomas stood at the altar looking at Emma, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The humiliation, the fear, the vindication, the healing. All of it had shaped him into someone capable of the love and partnership he was now entering. Sometimes we need to be broken down before we can be built back up into who we are meant to be. The story of King Charles and the Royal Guard eventually became part of palace lore. It told two new recruits as a lesson about the human side of service. It reminded them that everyone, from the newest guard to the king himself, was capable of mistakes and also capable of making things right. It taught them that dignity was not about never falling, but about how you got back up. And in the end, that is what this story was really about. Not about a moment of public humiliation or a conspiracy of revenge, but about the possibility of redemption for everyone involved. About how truth, compassion, and courage can transform pain into wisdom. About how the worst day of your life can become the foundation for your best years. About how we are all, every single one of us, human beings trying our best in an imperfect world. Deserving of grace when we fail and capable of growth when we try.